Great. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Police Foundation's Friday Exchange, although it's being held today on a Thursday, just so we could make it happen this week. I'm Rick Muir. I'm director of the Police Foundation. I know some of you have been to these sessions before. These are opportunities for us to have a conversation with someone really interesting from the world of policing, who's got lots of things to say about policing. And I'm delighted that this afternoon we're talking with Neil Basu, former Assistant Commissioner at the Met and former head of UK counter-terrorism policing. And just a few little points at the start, just before we get going. We are recording this session and it will be posted on our YouTube channel, so please bear that in mind with any questions or comments you make. If you'd like to ask a question or make a comment, you can do that through the chat function. So just place your questions in the chat and I will then choose questions to put to Neil. We're here for the next hour, and I think this is going to be an opportunity for a really rich conversation. So welcome, Neil, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for inviting me. When you've been retired from policing for nearly 2 years, it's incredibly flattering to be asked to still speak about it. So thank you.
No, it's an absolute pleasure. And I should also say that Neil is a senior associate fellow at the Police Foundation, so has a role with us at the foundation as well. So Neil, what we normally do at the start of these things is give people an opportunity just to talk a bit about their background, just to provide a bit of context. So could you tell us about how you first joined policing, why you first joined policing, how you got into this world in the first place?
That's a very long story, and you might have to read the memoir to get the full deal. I'll give you a very précise version. So I'm a mixed-race kid from an all-white town called Stafford up in the Potteries in the West Midlands. Son of a doctor and a nurse. Now, I didn't want to be a cop when I grew up, like those people who want to be police officers since they were little children. But we did live behind Staffordshire Police Headquarters, and my dad was a police surgeon as part of his contract as a general practitioner. So I did know a few cops and knew of a few cops and saw them running past my house. But I wanted to be a writer, actually a war correspondent. Well, I wanted to be a footballer like most kids, but I failed my trial. So then I wanted to be a writer, was too shy to turn up to the newspaper interview. And then I wanted to be a soldier. And unfortunately, I had a big car crash before my final interview, and I couldn't do that. And I couldn't do very much for 18 months. Drifted into university, got an economics degree. A pretty mediocre rugby players one, realised I needed a job before I left. And we were part of Thatcher's generation. So we all thought we were going to be rich. We thought the Wall Street film Greed is Good was an instruction manual. And I drifted into corporate finance and banking, hated it, resigned and thought, what am I going to do now? Realised, my great heroes were my mum and dad, who were public service heroes, and thought, what am I doing in the city of London chasing money when that doesn't float my boat at all? It's too late for me to be a soldier, and I'm nowhere near bright enough to be a doctor or a nurse. So I'm going to, what about that policing thing I used to think was my fallback? So I applied to join the police, resigned from the bank, didn't realise there'd be an 18-month waiting list to join, had to become a salesperson to pay my rent. So I was repping chocolate around Southeast London. I was very popular as a chocolate salesman, let me tell you. A lot more popular than as a banker or as a cop. And I finally got into Hendon in 1992. And people always say you never look back from the first day, but it took a while to acclimatise to what is an utterly incredible job. I mean, it is right, we get very institutionalised. We don't think anybody understands us unless they've done the job. But it is hard to understand it, as you know, Rick, unless you've been deeply involved in it or you've been alongside people who've done it. So it probably took me a couple of years to adjust, but after I had adjusted, there was no going back for me, and I had a wonderful 30-year career.
And could you tell us a bit about, I mean, again, briefly, because I know we've got a lot to talk about, but can you tell us a bit about your career? I think everybody knows where you ended up, in that you were, the head of counter-terrorism and assistant commissioner at the Met. But can you tell us a bit about how you got to that place?
Yeah, well, I was when I applied to join the Met, some bright spark in Met HR saw I had a degree, which wasn't common back then. So they sent it off to the Home Office, and I got a 3-day interview with the Home Office, like a mini senior assessment course for strategic command, but for brand new probationers. Passed that and got offered a job on their accelerated scheme. So I joined the job in '92. But just like everyone else, you have to go and walk the beat, quite rightly, something that is pretty anathema to most people these days, I think. But I was a beat Bobby in Battersea. I was actually part of the Lavender Hill mob, just around the corner from Lavender Hill Magistrates Court. Loved that. Still very good friends with the two cops who puppy walked me in Battersea. But I joined wanting to be a detective, and it was incredibly difficult. Nobody tells you how to do that. But without going into the long and short of it, I eventually, after some trainee detective roles, the accelerated course got very angry that I hadn't taken my sergeant's exams, and I was approaching 4 years in the job. So I had to take the sergeant's exams, and then you had to take the first promotion. So I couldn't become a detective sergeant because I wasn't a substantive DC. So I had to go and be a uniformed police sergeant, got transferred to Brixton, again joined an extraordinary team with an extraordinary leader, and I'm very good friends with a lot of that team still, 26 years later. Was a uniform custody sergeant and section sergeant for 18 months. Brilliant training, by the way. Those people doing direct entry detectives, sorry, my son is a direct entry detective, but I argued against it for years because you learn a great deal as a uniform officer, and you learn a great deal about how to handle trunky detectives as a custody sergeant. Did that. And then got whisked off to the Lawrence inquiry to work on the Stephen Lawrence, the response to William Macpherson's accusation that we were institutionally racist. So he hadn't published yet, but I spent 3 months helping a small team advise the commissioner and the management board on how to deal with that accusation. When I came back, I was made a detective sergeant in Streatham, and then, to cut a long story short, made my way to senior investigating officer, and I was in anti-corruption surveillance, homicide with Operation Trident for 4 years, dealing with gangland murders, serious and organised crime, kidnap and extortion. And that was my sort of foundation up to detective superintendent. And I was really enjoying that. And I got lifted out to be Paul Stevenson's staff officer in the Commissioner's office the year that Ian Blair got toppled as Commissioner. So I worked for a very difficult 12 months. Paul took over. I'd said I'd stay for 12 months, but I'd never wanted to do any of those kind of jobs. But I stayed for 100 days, for his first 100 days as commissioner, because I thought the world of him and I thought it was the right thing to do. And instead of making me detective chief superintendent of one of the big crime commands, he sent me to Barnet to be borough commander. I said, I don't want to do that. I've only ever wanted to be a detective. What are you doing? My whole career is to do this. And he said, we know you can detect things, Basu. You'll go and prove you can do something different if you want to be a chief constable. And I said, but I don't want to be a chief constable. And he said, I don't care. You're going to Barnet. So I went to Barnet. And actually, if he hadn't sent me to do that, great piece of leadership. Sometimes you need other people with a bit more wisdom than you to tell you what to do. It's the closest thing to being a chief constable, being a borough commander in charge of your own geography and your own people. And it was a remarkable experience. Came off that strategic command course, became a commander in the Met, ran Southeast London, ran armed policing, ran Operations Weeting, Two Letter and Elvedon, the media corruption inquiries into Rupert Murdoch and the News of the World and News Corps. Was still doing that, by the way, on the day I retired because of the civil actions, but anyway. And then tried to join Hampshire and then realised it was too far to travel because I dipped the first Deputy Assistant Commissioner's process. I didn't fail it, I was appointable, but there was only one job. And I lost out to Steve Rodhouse, and poor old Steve, he became the Gold Commander for Operation Midland. And if you follow policing, you'll understand what that meant. So maybe I was a lucky general. Bernard Hogan-Howe, Commissioner at the time, made me head of gangs and organised crime because he knew that would keep me in the Met. It's what I'd always wanted. But a second shot came up at DAC within 9 months. So I took that, got it. And Mark Rowley, who I'd worked for in organised crime and armed policing, decided to take me into counter-terrorism. And then I spent nearly 7 years in the top 3 jobs in counter-terrorism through some of our hardest times. I loved it, but a bit like boiling frog, I didn't realise what it was doing to me. So, but anyway. That's
Brilliant.
it.
I mean, what a career. I mean, absolutely fascinating. And I should signpost now that Neil has a memoir coming out. We'll talk a bit about that at the end, where I'm sure he talks a bit about this journey. Um, so just sort of stepping out of the personal into the sort of wider lens, um, I just wonder if we could start by talking a bit about the state of policing at the moment, the state we're in. I mean, a lot of people talk about, there's a sort of crisis in policing, a crisis of confidence in policing. I mean, how would you assess the current state of policing in the UK? Big question, but
Well, yeah, I did. I'm also an associate at Crest Advisory, and I did an interview with them the week that I retired back in November 2022. And you very kindly tweeted that if anyone wants to know how to solve the crisis of policing, they should watch this interview. I didn't think anyone was watching, but thank you very much, Rick. That was very kind of you. So go and watch it, because I watched it yesterday for the first time to see what I had said, and I was clearly quite angry because of
it
what
was a
had
brilliant, it was a
happened.
brilliant interview.
Well,
Brilliant.
what happened to me at the end of my career, which you might want to go on to, but is definitely in the memoir, had made me a little bit bitter. And I did describe policing in crisis, and Danny was very strident about that. So I would hope that nearly 2 years later, I'd be able to say that it wasn't. But unfortunately, everything I said in that interview is absolutely true. Policing is utterly overwhelmed, it's utterly under-resourced, and it's completely underappreciated for what it does. And there are lots of reasons, I mean, policing has to put its hands up and say it's not very good at its day job anymore, but it's not very good at its day job for some very critical reasons, which most chief constables are not allowed to talk about because they get criticised immediately. All public sector senior leaders have problems with resources and money. You have to prioritise, you have to get on with what you've got. Well, that's what we did. I'm one of the senior leaders that managed through 10 years of those austerity cuts to all kinds of services, and it was horrific. We took a Rolls Royce and we built a Ford Mondeo out of it. Well, I used to say that. Really, we took a Ford Mondeo and made a sort of Austin Allegro out of it. Nobody thought what we were doing was good. And actually, you can see the ramifications of everything that happened during austerity and what's happening now with the overwhelming demand, the crime types that have changed dramatically in the last 10 to 15 years, particularly with technology and digital crime. So cyber and fraud almost entirely ignored. A lot more work behind closed doors. It's less about public spaces. It's more about what's happening on the internet, often in encrypted platforms, incredibly difficult to police, almost impossible in reality. And what's happening behind people's doors. We were pretty poor at domestic abuse when I joined the job, but you look at the overwhelming demand and the reason for doing it. 1 in 3 homicides for a start, but we were really poor. I mean, it took Sarah Everard's horrendous murder to put violence against women and girls back on the map. And we were much better even before that than we had been when I joined. I'm embarrassed to say that people avoided those calls. When I was a uniformed officer, nobody wanted to get between partners and to get into, behind the front door. Well, you've got all of that to do, but you've got serious violence issues as well. You've got serious and organised crime issues. You've got serious gangland violence. You've got terrorism. So you have to deal with that as well. No public sector leader other than a chief constable who tries to prioritize gets anything other than completely mullered by either the local, the national politicians, or the press. You're not allowed to prioritize as a chief constable. You have to do everything. And I have to be honest, Rick, I'm not sad that I'm not a chief anymore, because I've no idea how to do that and get away with that kind of criticism. It just isn't possible. So at some point, and in fact, you and Michael Barber put it brilliantly in your strategic policing review, is somebody's got to decide what policing is for. I don't think we've answered that question since 1829, to be frank.
Yeah. What do you think are the we talked the Prime Minister talked this week about fixing the foundations, and this is the phrase which has been used. What do you what how do we go about fixing the foundations of policing in the context you've described?
Well, a lot of chief constables used to talk about back to basics, which unfortunately I thought, that was a bit of a sop to a criminal deterrence adherence. So a conservative ideology is, lock them up, throw away the key, and everything will be fine. The longer you're in policing, and I'm sorry to introduce politics so early because I will end up sounding like the woke Labour person that people think I am. That's not the case. I am actually apolitical, but I know quite a lot about policing. And if you've been in policing as long as I have, and any experienced police officer will tell you, locking them up and throwing away the key doesn't work. Now, it very clearly doesn't work in this country, but neither does the rest of the system. So I think Keir's got it right with, the Prime Minister's got it right with the fixing the foundation moments, because he's actually looking at the whole system for once. And generations of politicians of all colours and types have not looked at it as a system. So we're the front end of the system. So policing's got to get a lot better at investigation and prevention. You know, its basic core mission is keeping people safe. And to do that, actually preventing crime is much more important in some respects than the arrest and the conviction. It's actually about prevention. And that was Peel's first principle. So we have got to get better at that, but you can only do that in partnership with lots of other people and lots of other agencies, all of which were also broken by austerity. You know, if people say our only job is to fight crime and we shouldn't do anything else, well, that's fine as long as you're signposting vulnerable individuals that you come across. We're always first on scene, to the mentally ill, to the lost, to the bewildered. You know, we are always first on scene, you know. And when I started, we were social service of last resort, and my colleagues really hated that. I loved it. I thought, what a fantastic place to be, where nobody else in the world can help but you. You know, I'd like to think I was entirely selfless and doing it for public service, but you get a massive kick out of that. But they didn't like it. But unfortunately, what's happened now is they're social service of the first resort. And that's a dreadful place to be. So when you're signposting people to mental health, to drug addiction counselling, to, you don't want to lock these people up. You want them to get better and to stop offending. There's no one there to help them do that. Even if you get them behind bars, and I listened to Charlie Taylor and my friend Adrian Usher, the inspector and ombudsman of the prison system. I mean, prisons are a despicable place to be now. I mean, we should be ashamed of it as a country, that that's the state our prisons are in. You might not like prisoners very much, but if you're a law-abiding citizen, you don't want them released being what they are today. Look at the recidivism rates, look at the alcoholism, look at the drug addiction rate for people coming out of prison. I mean, that is just an extraordinary place for a civilized society to be. Then somebody in probation's got to look after them, and we managed to break the probation system, and we've tried to refix it, but it's got nowhere near enough people for the number of people that now need to be let out to give some slack to the system. So I could go on and on, the entire system. In fact, the one thing I've missed is the one thing that I've just been reading Richard Enrique's book, From Crime to Crime. He gives his last chapter as a 10-point analysis of what's gone wrong with the courts. Well, I couldn't agree with him more. I mean, the courts are utterly broken. So if you're a victim and we have to deal with you, we've successfully arrested somebody. We don't do that very often these days. We've charged them, we've put them into the system, and it'll be 2 years before you get any justice. 2 years of living with the hell of thinking about that. It's very unlikely you're going to want to turn up to court in 2 years' time. So that whole system, and I used to think I was being melodramatic, but I'm not the only person who talks like this. Anyone with insider knowledge, like the appellant judge Enriquez, like the inspector of prisons, like Andy Cook, our own HMIC FRS, read what they say about the system. It's utterly broken. So he needs to fix it from start to finish. Now, policing obviously has to get its own act in order. So it is going to have to start pushing back on politicians and saying we can only do these things. It is going to have to say we've got a problem with professional standards. I'm going to have to divert resources into professional standards. Mark Rowley's been doing it for 2 years in the Met and getting a bit of a kicking for that. It's going to have to say we're going to have to prioritise certain things because we can't do everything. And you need to give me some political top cover to do that and give me some space in the press for me to actually get good at the things I should be good at. I'm not at all confident that we live in a climate where people are willing to have that nuanced debate and to give that top cover, either from the public, from the press, or from our politicians. But we have an entirely new administration now, and I'm hoping they'll understand the problems that I've just outlined, and they will be seeking to support chief constables in delivering that, instead of chiding them, constantly trying to reform them, mostly badly over the last 14 years. We can talk about that. And giving them a little bit more of the resource that they actually need, or at least giving regional authorities the funding or the power to increase resources so that the public can actually get what they want, which is police officers they can see who turn up when there's a solvable crime and who actually charge criminals. And we don't have that at the moment.
Yeah. And you talked there about you talked about the press and about politicians, and I'd like to sort of touch on those topics, because I know you've got some personal experience of dealing with both politicians and the press. And what do you how would you describe what's happened to the relationship between the police and politics over the last decade or so? And I know we've just had an election, so there's an opportunity for change. But how would you describe how that relationship's sort of evolved in recent years?
It's interesting. So when I was AXO, I briefed 2 prime ministers, 4 home secretaries, and 5 security ministers. That tells you something about the problem of accountability, consistency. Every time somebody comes new into that post, you have to completely rebrief them again with a Janet and John on national security. It's the same in policing. It's a complex profession. Some people think it's very simple. It's actually one of the most complicated. Just think how many pieces of legislation and the instant kind of decision making police officers have to make. It's incredibly difficult to do, and it requires some support from its leadership, but also from the public. And it's a two-way street. Don't get me wrong. Before I say anything else, policing has the first responsibility to win trust and confidence. They shouldn't just expect it from the public. So they have to get that right. But if they're doing good things, then they should be appreciated for that. And I see them only appreciated when they're killed or injured in the line of duty. And what we've seen in the last decade, particularly in London, so we've seen an awful lot of press and politics take out commissioners of the day. Ian Blair and Cress were both taken out when crime figures were going the right way, but they were taken out for political reasons, one for a standards issue. And in fact, the straw that broke the camel's back was the Charing Cross investigation in the Met and the behaviour of that particular crime squad. That investigation took place before Cress became commissioner, but it's still the straw that broke her back. With Ian Blair, I mean, all the kind of serious youth violence that was such a big thing for his commissionership was all going in the right direction. And the Met on paper was looking very good. But of course, his face didn't fit with the new mayor of the day. That was Boris and his deputy mayor, Kit Malthouse, and he was asked to leave on day one of their tenure. So if politics is capable of doing that to chief constables, what chance have they got to set some priorities and to start dealing with very intractable problems? The most wicked problems in society tend to be law and order related problems, largely rooted in poverty and addiction and mental health. That's where a lot of the serious issues are, which cannot be solved very quickly. You need political support. You don't need stop-start funding. You don't need a politician changing every 5 minutes. And you don't need politicians who have their own particular thing that they think is going to get them voted in, which is not supporting the whole of the constituency that voted for them or the whole of the country that voted for them. It's a particular thing. It's a particular philosophy, or it's a particular crime type that they want to focus on. And that skews the entire ability of the machine to do its job. So until you start setting some clear but specific priorities and then letting chief constables get on with their job for a significant period of time, we won't win what we need. We won't win the trust and confidence that we need. Yeah. We won't have that support.
Yeah, that's really well put. I mean, the other aspect of this, which you see commissioners deal with all the time, chief constables deal with all the time, is the relationship with the media and the press. How would you sort of characterize that? And has that sort of changed over the course of your career?
Well, you shouldn't take on the fourth estate because you're going to lose. I'm sitting here retired partly as a result of it. You have to have a close relationship with the press. I mean, what's interesting is I told a bunch of journalists, one in particular, who was giving me a very hard time. I said, you do realize that the one thing I wanted to do when I was a kid was grow up and become a journalist. And he looked at me and said, the one thing I wanted was to become a cop. And look where we are. And I've still got some very close friends who are journalists. Detectives and journalists have they're natural partners. They're both nosy sods. They want to know what's happened. They want to find out the truth. They're good investigators. My heroes were Woodward and Bernstein, who uncovered a presidential corrupt plot. Journalism like that is extraordinary and is absolutely the bedrock of a liberal democracy, which I think it is not. But that's not the journalism we've got. A lot of journalism we've got is lazy. The ultimate lazy, corrupt journalism was the phone hacking scandal. But we have people now who are just scraping social media posts from anywhere they can get it and then reproducing it. And publishers have got to be better than that, and the mainstream media has got to be the place we go to trust, to get verifiable facts, to have a balanced argument, to see both sides of the argument so we can make up our minds. I don't think we've got that. I read a lot of press. I don't do social media at all. I still fact check with the BBC. I read the Times, the Financial Times, the Guardian, the Spectator. I try and read a broad spread of stuff so that I can then make up my own mind. I'd like to be able to do that with one paper because it would A, be cheaper, and B, even I haven't got the time to do it. But you can't do that anymore. So until we get to a position where we're not having this incredibly polarized, quick them versus us, I must be right all the time. Until we stop having those conversations as a society, we're in trouble. Please don't ask me what the cure for that is. And that's what's really changed you asked what's changed over the last 10 years in policing. That's what's changed in society. It's had ramifications for all of us, but particularly for policing, law and order, mental health, the younger generation, how they've been influenced. That's been pretty pernicious. And I saw an awful lot of that in my near 7 years in counter-terrorism.
And what about, social media specifically? Because that is, because I confess, I always used to see social media as a bit of a sort of as an add-on to to the media, and I think I was completely wrong about that. It seems to me it's profoundly changed the nature of public discourse. And what's your view on that? Particularly in the extremism and counter-terrorism world, it must have had an influence.
Yeah, huge influence, not just on counter-terrorism and counter-extremism, but on suicide, self-harm, the collapse of mental health in the young, all of these things. Don't take my word for it. Read Jonathan Haidt, The Anxious Generation, brilliant book, which describes exactly the pernicious nature of social media and what it does to young people, and prescribes some solutions, and people are looking at that very seriously. Think about all the effort that's gone into the Online Harms Act and all the lobbying that's gone against it and how long that's taken. You wouldn't be lobbying against something you didn't think was a problem. It's a bit like big tobacco saying, I don't know why you're asking us not to advertise. Advertising doesn't really work, does it? Really? You spend hundreds of millions of pounds on it. And social media has become this propaganda tool it should have been humankind's greatest invention. It's still a brilliant tool for all kinds of connecting people, for people in countries where their voices can't be heard. There's a huge benefit from having social media, but it has been turned into something pretty dark in some places. And those people who are running those platforms have to take some responsibility for that. I used to say, you're not a platform anymore, you're a publisher. Long before the Online Harm Act was coming in, Mark Rowley, then me, we were talking about social media being an incredible amplifier of dangerous propaganda that was driving a significant minority of people who were vulnerable into a space of extremism, radicalization, and eventually violence. You have to do something about that if you control that platform. If you don't do something about that, you are complicit. And we have just seen this week the arrest, detention, and bailing of the head of Telegram, a service that would never speak to us. When I was in counter-extremism and counter-terrorism, at least the big six would have a relationship with you. It was very tense, didn't always go the way we wanted, but at least they'd actually, not so much to us as the professional law enforcement. They didn't like speaking to law enforcement, but they would, if a government got involved and if an attorney general got involved, they would speak, not Telegram. So, I know one of his supporters has said it's a bit like arresting Macron for every crime that's happened in France. You can't arrest Durov for every crime that's happened on Telegram. Well, he's been warned for a decade about doing something about it, and he's chosen not to do anything about it at all. Now, some of the other platform owners have done too little and need to do more. This might be a massive wake-up call to some of them, I would think. And I know I'll get criticized for, well, it's all about free speech and you're against free speech. I'm not at all, but people think free speech is something that is just an inalienable human right, and it isn't. You don't have an absolute right to free speech. It comes with responsibility. You don't have the freedom to do harm to other people. And that's what it's become in lots of places. And society has to do something about that. Not people like me. Well, yes, people like me. I'm a normal citizen now. Police officers can't ask for that. They shouldn't ask for laws, and they shouldn't lobby in public. But I can do that now. I'm part of a voting generation that should tell its politicians that you want to do something about extremist dialogue. You want to do something about it. And then politicians should debate it, and then we should have a vote on it, and we should understand where our red lines are as a society. So we should debate free speech as a society, and politicians should come to a conclusion. They've been ducking that issue for as long as I can remember. You know, counter-extremism strategy, since the government's contest strategy was first put in place, has been kicked around like a football between people who didn't really want to touch it. Separated from counter-terrorism. I can understand why you don't want to securitize extremists who aren't radicalists and violent. So you want to deal with them outside of the national security architecture. That made sense. I sort of could see where Theresa May was going, but it failed. It failed because they didn't realize that the crossover was much deeper than we thought. They scrapped the strategy in 2021. What a mistake. So you've had experts like Louise Casey and Sarah Khan talking about community cohesion, counter-extremism. It's all been ignored. And you can't tell me that we haven't just had our eyes open to the result of 10 to 15 years of ignoring this problem, which is exactly what happened in Southport, with causes everything from a massive increase in inequality to a complete inability to have a sensible conversation about immigration since the 1950s. I mean, you've only got to look at history. You know, that has been a problem causing a riot about every 10 years since the Windrush generation arrived, because we can't have a proper conversation. It's just extreme left or extreme right. And when you're economically disadvantaged and you feel like the whole world's against you, it's very easy to find a scapegoat, and it's very easy for some pretty reprehensible characters to use particularly social media to stir that up. And that's exactly what you saw 2 or 3 weeks ago.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that because I mean, I know that when you were lead on counter-terrorism, that there were lots of different threats, but one of the ones that I think you highlighted, a number of others have highlighted, is the issue of right-wing extremism. And I just wondered what role you thought that played in the events of the riots of a couple of weeks ago.
I think there would have been I spoke out during the riots. I was asked to sort of make comments on some stuff, and two things I could not believe is that we were, in the first 48 hours, all we were talking about was violent disorder, when on day one, 51 of my colleagues ended up, seriously injured, and 29 of them in hospital. I sort of thought that's an extraordinary thing. Even for a London copper, that was quite an extraordinary and shocking moment. And I looked at some of the images, and what I was seeing was very clearly riot, not violent disorder. They're two separate offences. Violent disorder, 5 years in prison. Riot, 10. Riot comes with lots of difficulties for governments because of compensation under the Riot Act. So the cynic in me thought, we don't want to call it a riot because this might get ugly across the whole country and it might get very expensive. I hope that wasn't the case, because I note some people have now been charged with riot. So those offences were very obvious to me, but one was particularly obvious, which was a group of white balaclavaed thugs surrounding a mosque, trying to burn it down with the worshippers inside. Now, I said this on mainstream media. If that had been a group of Muslim kids balaclavaed up, trying to burn down a church with white worshippers inside, and I was still the head of terrorism, I guarantee I would have had a call from the Prime Minister's office saying, why haven't you been out in front of the yard declaring this a terrorist incident? Nobody said it. I was the only person, I think, in the country who said, why is that not a terrorist offence? I was very grateful to the DPP later on in the week, who said, if I am presented with the evidence, I am willing to look at potential charges of terrorism. I'm grateful to Jonathan Hall, who made the argument that, yes, some of these offences do meet the legal definition of terrorism, but whether you want to use terrorist legislation when you have other legislations on the books. And he was right about that. It's a very serious step. But the reason I was saying it was, I was trying to deter people from going out and committing these horrendous offences. But the people who were doing that were from a hugely broad spectrum, from centre-right people who have a legitimate political view, who wanted to protest peacefully about, too much immigration, and I don't like the way some Islam is practiced in this country. You've got a right to say that. You've got a right. It's a political point of view. You can protest peacefully, and in fact, police have a duty to help you protest peacefully and lawfully if that's what you want to do, right to the extreme right-wing terrorism end that I used to deal with. And I could see all of that entire spectrum. And my point is, policing can deal with the far end of it, the rioters and the terrorists. Society has to deal with the bit in the middle. Why are these people coming out and behaving the way that they're behaving? And it's particularly based in immigration, the hatred of immigration and the hatred of, I'd say Muslims, but it's actually brown people. I mean, I've even had the mainstream media call me the Muslim head of counter-terrorism. I'm the proud son of a Hindu and I'm an atheist, but no one ever asked me. Presumably because I had a beard at the time, I must have been a Muslim, but this was very clearly racist behavior. We've got to ask ourselves the question, why in 2024 are we in that place? And I always say this, as a mixed race, I retired as the most senior officer of colour in the UK. I said things about institutional racism in policing. I still think it's got a problem that it won't address. I said a lot of these things, but I was born in England. I'm a proud royalist. I'm a patriot. I'm incredibly proud to be British. I'm half Indian and half Welsh. I was born in England, but I'm half Indian and half Welsh. Really proud of that as well. It is entirely possible to be a good British patriot and not be a white Anglo-Saxon. It's entirely possible. And I don't understand why people can't see that. But when I look at the British Attitude Survey and the length of time that's been running, since I was born in 1968, just a few weeks after Enoch Powell's speech changed the lives of people who look like me. He changed it for all of us. My parents will talk to you about racism before that speech and how much it increased after that speech. But this society has become unbelievably more tolerant in the 57 years I've been in it. It's the only white country in the world I would want to live in. It's by far the most tolerant, and I have studied a lot of the other ones and their rising extremism, their far-right politics, the polarization in their society. I'd still rather live here. What you have is a significant minority of people, but it's still a minority. The majority of people don't feel like that. And the most wonderful thing, if ever there was a silver lining, it was watching the majority of people come out and protest against the rioters. That's Great Britain. And by the way, I was spending most of my time actually watching the Olympics, watching the most diverse Olympic team in history wrapping themselves in the Union Jack. That was Great Britain. That's Great Britain. Certainly the Great Britain I want to live in. So the government's got to do something about that. They should get Louise Casey back in, dust off her report and start implementing it. They should get Sarah Khan back in, dust off her reports, all commissioned by Conservative administrations and then ignored, and start implementing the things she talked about. You don't have to listen to me. There's much more celebrated and important people who've done good work in this area, who know what they're talking about, who could help. And of course, I hate to say it, but I can't remember if it was Clinton who said it, but it's the economy, stupid.
Yeah.
The more you have haves and have-nots in society, the quicker they will turn.
Yeah.
And that's been the case. It's how the Third Reich ascended in the 30s in Germany. It was based on depression and who can we blame? That sounds melodramatic, but that's exactly how it happened. And it started with name calling. It started with press. It started with political rhetoric, and it went on to violence and rioting, and eventually to the greatest inhumanity we've ever known. It starts somewhere, and we need to be really careful about where it starts. And I would say the proudest thing I did in my counter-terrorism career was putting extreme right-wing terrorism on the map when most of the country didn't think it was important. And when I started in CT, it was 5% of the casework. When I left, it was 20%. Right-wing press used to edit my comments and say, the man's an idiot. Doesn't he realize that Islamist terrorism is the biggest terrorist threat he faces? Yeah, I was the one who was awake 24/7, 365 days a year for 6 years dealing with it. I knew that was 80% of our work. What was rising much faster than that was far right and extreme right wing terrorism. And one of the Amber Rudd, thank God for Amber Rudd, who prescribed national action in 2016. Her prescription enabled us to take that organisation apart. And it was basically the illegitimate son of the National Front that I had grown up with as a child. So my proudest moment as a middle-aged man who thought I'd have got the opportunity to break their successor. Brilliant. But trying to open people's eyes to, you have a problem in your country that you have to nip in the bud. Whether you think it's, a large part of society, I don't think it is. I think it's a small part of society, but now is the time to deal with it. And you have to deal with it in two ways: through strong enforcement from my old colleagues, and from changing society and having a conversation about what caused it. I'm waiting for the conversation. I think maybe the Prime Minister's speech this week was the start of that conversation, perhaps.
Yeah, no, I mean, really powerfully put, Neil. You talked about institutional racism and policing, and I did want to talk about that because I mean, so you were involved going right back to Macpherson and how the Met responded to Macpherson. We've then more recently had the Casey report into the Met, which found institutional racism, homophobia, and misogyny in the Met. And I'm sure most people in policing would say that lots of the things that were found in the Met are true of many other police forces as well. What is your view of the way in which policing has responded to what Louise Casey and other related reports found? And do you think that policing has properly gripped this issue of institutional racism?
So they've responded incredibly poorly, and they haven't gripped it at all, would be my short answer. So I asked National Police Chiefs Council. We had a debate on the issue about accepting institutional racism. The debate was timed because we were about to release the National Police Race Action Plan, which we had decided would be specifically about improving our policing service to the Black community, because that's where trust and confidence was lowest. I regret that now, because actually, when I talk about institutional matters these days, I talk about institutional prejudice, and that's what Louise was pointing at. It wasn't just race, So I think the problem policing has is institutional bullying. That's the disease. The symptoms are the isms, the racism, the homophobia, the misogyny, those are the symptoms, but the problem is institutional bullying. Too much power over people, finding somebody's weakness, and whatever your particular predilection, you'll find that weakness and you'll exploit it. And we attract way too many bullies, and we create them because the job is brutal. We get institutionalized. We don't think of people as citizens. We don't think of ourselves as citizens. We think of ourselves as somehow a breed apart. In the worst of us, and police culture can be magnificent, putting your life on the line for strangers you don't know, walking side by side with your teammates into danger, an incredible team ethos, a selflessness that comes from public service, not doing it for the money, but for a little bit for king and country, but a little bit because you want to help society. All of that stuff is magnificent. So let's not say police culture is rotten. But at the dark side of police culture, which is the minority, is this abuse of power over other people. And that's the thing that needs to be addressed. Now, I've criticised the Commissioner in public on the London Policing Board, and because he wouldn't accept institutional racism as a term. At least Mark accepted, he wanted to change the language because he knew, by the way, he knew that language would get him fired by the Conservative administration because they don't, and I'll talk about that. But he uses the term systemic. So Mark knows that it is not just about individual racists or individually prejudiced people in policing, which absolutely we should identify and fire. And we've had some strange decisions recently where people who are clearly prejudiced have been given words of advice or management action or reflective practice. If you really want a zero tolerance policy, when you're proved to have done something prejudicial, you should be out straight away. And then people would understand where the red line was. He started very well. Wait to see if he continues with the professional standards approach. Okay, he hasn't accepted institutional as a word, but he's accepted systemic. And now I hope he's going to do something about changing the system. Because what I would say about today, and it's what I said back in December 2021 to Chiefs Council, is you've got an opportunity here to acknowledge the fact that nothing has changed since 1999. You still disproportionately stop and search, use of force, recruit, retain and promote badly from ethnic minority communities, and disproportionately ignore their grievances, or put them through misconduct. Those figures haven't changed. And I've seen the latest figures in the Met. They haven't changed. And, you know, if Louise Casey comes back to investigate the Met, I think she'll be scratching her head as to where that change has actually happened. So, and that is absolutely the case for all of policing. And the fact that only 5 chief constables have admitted institutional racism and 2 of us are retired is a pretty damning indictment of the 52 chief constables that exist who've chosen not to do it. So I ask myself why? Because all of the data, your Black and Asian officers, the staff associations, your communities, your Black and Asian communities, Black and Asian press, Black and Asian members of politics, of society, of arts and media, they all tell you you're institutionally racist, but you decide not to accept it, even though all of that data is telling you you are. And you had a fantastic opportunity to launch the action plan on the back of an admission, an apology, and a real commitment to that action, which then should have been followed up by a Home Secretary saying, yes, I want you to represent the communities. I want you to win their trust and confidence back. I want victim satisfaction to improve in those communities. So I'm going to have you regulated and inspected on it. So I will tell HMIC to do it. None of those things happened. None of that happened, which told me exactly where the policy was and where policing was going on this particular issue. When I was told in January, Martin Hewitt had a vote. So even at the debate, only 14 chief constables spoke. And actually, the majority of those were in favour of admitting it, in my argument. 1 chief constable spoke against me, the for and against debate. And Martin realised, because it's always tacked on to the very end of a chief's council, by the way, you look at all the minutes, it's the last issue when most chief constables have switched off and left a long time ago, every 2-day meeting. He realised nobody was going to be brave enough to actually put the vote to the floor in front of their colleagues. So he asked people to write in individually. And I was rung up by a member of his executive council in January to say, I'm sorry, Neil, the vote went against you. We're not going to do that. The forward to the plan will not say we're institutionally racist. We're not going to admit it. We're not going to apologise. End of. That crystallised my decision to retire. Because I just did not trust an entire generation of chief constables to do anything about this problem at all. And if you think about the National Race Action Plan, so Dr. Hadari, I know Ellie, who's got that. She's a brilliant, high-principled, high-valued individual who's now the leader of that program. So I wish her every success, and I hope it's going to be good. But she is the 3rd leader of that program in 4 years. Unlike violence against women and girls, which had a fully funded team, resources, and a national communications action plan, and a dedicated Deputy Chief Constable, Maggie Blythe, Deputy at the College of Policing now, and also a phenomenal senior female leader and cop. We did exactly the right thing with violence against women and girls. It took 3 months from having our eyes opened and having all the criticism post-Everard to say, you must do something. That was the right speed and the right reaction. It was nearly 2 years after George Floyd when we started talking about finally having a race and equality plan that we could all get behind. Nearly 2 years later before it was published, and it's on its 3rd leader. I don't know how much more I have to say, why would you have any confidence in that at all? And you know, I know, and I guess the question I hope you'd want to ask me is, why do chief constables not want to accept it? And actually, I found it in the minutes of May 2022 that are online. The media backlash and the front line. And just like 1999, when I was a young sergeant, Paul Condon was right. Policing will not understand institutional racism. They'll just hear the word racist. And they are worried that that will happen again, that every individual police officer, all 145,000 of them, will think they're being called a racist. Well, that's a leadership issue because we didn't explain it to them in 1999 when we accepted it. And we haven't tried to explain it to them now because we haven't said anything about it at all other than we're not going there. And if you put your front line, which is majority white, majority male, and will be upset by this, but if you're putting them and the possibility that the media will criticize you before the feelings of the people it actually affects, the communities who have no trust and confidence in you. And it isn't just me who feels like this. I speak to large groups in other industries and other companies, I've spoken to a lot of their officers who are black and brown, who don't tell them, they tell me, because they very quickly forget I'm an assistant commissioner because of the way I look. You know, I'm just another ethnic minority officer. So they blurt it out. And the first thing I say to them is, have you told anybody in your organization? And they look at me as though I'm utterly insane.
Yeah.
That is still going on. And all I'd say, and when I joined in 1992, 100% of black, Asian, and female officers you'd meet would have a horror story about the way they had been spoken to, treated, or even assaulted. When Louise Casey came in 2021 to start her report and published in 2023, she found it was 30% of female officers and 50% of black and Asian officers. Now, I do actually see that as progress. It just that cannot possibly be good enough for a profession that has that amount of power over people and should be providing a policing service to everybody, not just the ones it likes. So that 30% and that 50% don't appear to be being listened to, as far as I'm concerned.
And how, I mean, I guess the question that comes on from that is how will this change? I mean, will it require government leadership and intervention? I mean, what do you think that will be the spark for really getting people to focus properly on this?
There's never a one silver bullet, but it could have changed quite dramatically had they admitted it and apologized for it. So that would have been that's step number one. I mean, nobody who looks like me believes them because they haven't admitted or apologized for anything. You know, that is if you want to change, if we think you're going to change something, or you want forgiveness, or you're willing to say you did something wrong, that's a massive step. Not taking that step. If you take that step, then the community might be willing to start to give you the benefit of the doubt. And by the way, if you don't believe the moral case for diversity, I always tell people in my profession, particularly when I was on Trident, I relied on that community for intelligence. I relied on it for cooperative witnesses, for victims to be able to come to court and give evidence. I absolutely relied on the community's trust and confidence. And if you don't think that's important, then the front line who might be against this, if they have proper trust and confidence in you, what happens now is they're very happy to watch you get your head kicked in public. You know, they might even join in, but what they will definitely do is they'll record you on their cameras and they will post it. Wouldn't it be better if they wanted to step in and save you rather than... So if you don't believe my moral case for doing the right thing about it, there is a very clear business case for law enforcement about actually getting that trust and confidence back. Now, if the new government believes in that, and I think they do, I heard Lisa Nandy say the culture wars are over. I think Yvette Cooper really gets this as Home Secretary, that there's a real problem in not representing the communities you serve, in the terrible trust and confidence figures, in the lack of victim satisfaction, all of which is worse amongst black, brown and female victims and members of the community. And particularly the disabled, by the way. I mean, that's the lowest trust and confidence, even more so than the black community. So I think they get this. So I'd be asking Andy Cook at HMIC FRS, why isn't this a standard part of the Peel inspection? They all signed up to the race action plan. Why aren't you inspecting on it? Why aren't you giving people, you know, poor, adequate, well done in that particular area? Because, you know, if a Home Secretary doesn't care, the HMIC isn't going to care. And if you don't get inspected on it, and the government of the day doesn't say anything about it, or is actively against it, as the previous administration was, which was to ban... The ERG end of the Conservative Party wanted to ban anything to do with DE&I. The culture war was all about that's just woke nonsense. Just giving you the business case for it. It's not woke nonsense. It's good policing, in my view. But why would you want, you know, why would a chief constable waste all that time and effort if the politicians don't care who give them the funding and they're not inspected on it? They won't. They won't do anything about it at all. And I think, you know, if you went in now and started investigating what forces are actually doing with that action plan, I think you'd probably find, I really hope in my heart that you'll find 43 Scotland and Northern Ireland doing amazing things about it. I really hope that, because I love being a police officer and I love my profession and I love lots of people in it. But I don't think that will be the case.
Yeah. Well, just as we're coming towards the end of the conversation, which has been an incredibly rich and stimulating conversation, and you've written a memoir, and just wanted to give you a bit of an opportunity to talk about well, first of all, why did you write it, and what are the things that you've been trying to say through this memoir?
Well, thank you for giving me the opportunity. Terrible getting a free plug, isn't it? I'm so sorry. It's called Turmoil. The working title is 30 Years of Policing, Politics and Prejudice, which should tell you something about why I wrote it. I wrote it actually as an apology to my sons. You should never tell your publisher that you only really want a readership of 3. But I did. I wrote it because if I hadn't been asked to publish it, I probably never would have sat down and written it. I would have always thought about writing. So, and it's a big thing to write down something so your children, and hopefully in the future my grandchildren, will understand why I did what I did. Very few people understand the job. I'm hoping it makes people understand why it's vocational, why it's one of the jobs that requires you to put other people's families before your own. And that's partly the apology, because I left my family behind. I'm twice divorced. I'd give all of the medals and awards back for 5 minutes more with my kids growing up. So I wrote it for them. The second reason was I described it to my editor as it's a love letter to policing, but it's from an angry lover. So when I retired, it was just before Louise, who is a friend of mine, and I was one of her critical readers on her report. It was just before that was published. I remember walking away, having read it, in tears, thinking I'd wasted 30 years of my life. So I felt both a victim and a perpetrator of that report. So it's just the anger at where policing culture has fallen and where professional standards has gone, our inability to solve crime, where policing is in the image of the public. And I know that 80% of police officers are extraordinary, and they should be. They should be the best of society. I know that. I worked with thousands of them. So I know what it can be, but that culture's got to change. And the last thing is I wrote it as a cathartic experience because I was horribly messed up when I left. And it took, nearly a year of therapy to get myself sorted out. And writing it was a big part of that. So it was a tremendous cathartic exercise. And I sit on the board of a charity called Police Care UK, which deals with physically and mentally damaged officers and their families. And it's interesting, if I can feel like that as an assistant commissioner, imagine what it feels like to be a frontline responder for 30 years and what that does to you. And there is I'm sick of policing only being appreciated when someone is killed or injured in the line of duty. People should understand what they go through every day. And I hope by reading the journey of my career, you'll understand some of the things I've had to deal with, which no human being should have to deal with. My great friend, Richard Reynolds, a Lavender Hill legend back in the 90s, was on ITV, and a journalist asked him, it was at the time of the Sheehy report, telling us we were all overpaid and we were no better than Tesco shop assistants. We were quite angry. Somehow Richie got on primetime news. This PC I remember our inspector going, who let Richard Reynolds be interviewed? And he was extraordinary. I won't go into his whole interview, but in response to the question, do you think you're well paid, PC Reynolds? And he said, I'm really well paid for what I do. I'm nowhere near paid well enough for what I might have to do.
Yeah.
You only have to look at the riots to understand that. But, in 1993, that was quite a line. I've never forgotten it. And I think people should appreciate what they've got. Because if they don't, people won't join. People are leaving in droves. They are finding it difficult to recruit. You don't want a society that doesn't have Peel's police force in it. You really don't.
Yeah. Brilliant. Well, Neil, look, this has been an absolutely fantastic conversation. Thank you so much. And I'm sure everyone online will have really appreciated it. A very personal and also just really powerful set of reflections on a career in policing. So I would encourage people to go out and read Neil's memoir, because I think if you've got anything out of the last hour, I'm sure you'll get a huge amount out of however many hours it will take to read the memoir. But thank you so much, Neil. It's really appreciated, and we're getting comments through from people thanking you as well. So thanks for all your time.
My pleasure, Rick.
And just to say to everyone watching, we will be, lots of the themes that Neil's been talking about today, we at the Police Foundation will be exploring and looking into in the months and years ahead, particularly around trust and confidence, reforming the service, the prevention, institutional racism. I mean, all of these are big themes for us that we'll be exploring in the months ahead. The next of our sessions on this, I think, is happening in October. Look out on our social media feed, and we'll be talking to the chair of the national chair of the Police Federation, Steve Hartshorn. I think that's our next session. So do keep an eye on our social media feeds, and you'll get a link to sign up for that event. But thanks very much to Neil, and thanks to you all for joining us. Thanks.
Thank you for listening.